American, but to Europe, the Caribbean, India, and Asia. As the French were forced to direct their attention to Europe and to other more valuable parts of their empire, the British were able to take advantage on the North American front, with the British Navy actively keeping the French from not being able to resupply along the St. Lawrence River. British and American colonial forces successfully captured Fort Niagara, Fortress Louisbourg, and the city of Quebec. As the French lost more and more ground, it became clear that the fight for North America was over. In 1760, British General Geoffrey Amherst managed to secure a formal surrender from the governor of New France, Pierre-François de Ragueau, Marquis de Vaudreuil-Cavagnol, and largely ended the hostilities in North America. Meanwhile, the 7 Years' War continued abroad and continued to carve pieces from the Kingdom of France and her allies. In 1763, the 7 Years' War officially came to an end, and the French and Indian War with it. Casualties were astronomical for the period, with some estimates reaching as high as 1.4 million. Of that number, the French and Indian War accounted for roughly 23,000 killed, wounded, or captured, just under 2% of the total casualties of the global conflict. For nearly a century, England had beaten back the French, Dutch, and Spanish empires, gradually cementing its claim to the New World. Over the course of the 18th century, the successes of the British Empire during these conflicts had created the ideal conditions for their colonies in North America to experience an incredible population boom. From roughly 250,000 in 1700 to more than 1.25 million in 1750. The raw materials produced by the American colonies, including hemp, copper, and tar, were necessary for the British Army and Navy to wage war and protect the vastly growing empire. While it was in the interest of the British Empire to defeat the French and secure their North American holdings, it had also been in the colonists' interests. The English colonists had no great love for the French, and anti-Catholic sentiment was a regular part of colonial life, especially in places like New England, which had been staunchly Protestant for the first 2 centuries of its settlement. That the American colonies were made up chiefly of individuals of the Protestant faith was, naturally, no coincidence. Many Protestant organizations had funded the various colonization efforts through the 17th century, and had maintained a lasting impact and presence into the 1700s. However, the strongest impact of Protestantism in the American colonies came during the colonial wars, which dominated the early and mid-18th century. A global religious phenomenon occurred, known as the Great Awakening, gripped both Europe and North America, and brought the Protestant faith to new heights. The Great Awakening was a major evangelical revival which expanded the Protestant faith throughout Europe and colonial North America. The revival brought about new religious theories and dogma, as concepts such as the nature of salvation and the idea of rebirth were spread by itinerant preachers who traveled the countryside giving sermons and lectures as they saw fit. These preachers were tremendous orators and captured captive audiences wherever they went. George Whitefield, a major player in this evangelical movement, traveled across the colonies and preached in major cities and small towns wherever he could gather a crowd. And gather them he did. In October 1740, while preaching in Boston, Massachusetts, Whitefield allegedly drew a crowd of more than 30,000 people from around New England. To put that in perspective, Boston was the highest populated city in colonial North America in 1740, coming in at roughly 17,000 people living in and around the city. Nearly double the city's population was present to hear Whitefield speak. The movement revived the religious spirit of Christian peoples and reaffirmed their faith through periods of intense conflict and uncertain survival. While the revival did not change governments or raise great armies as religious revivals had done in the past in Europe, the Great Awakening was formative for many individuals in colonial North America, many of whom would go on to be the founding fathers and mothers of the nation. The 1763 Treaty of Paris saw enormous territorial gains for Great Britain. Vast swaths of formerly French-occupied land were now British colonies, including Canada, all of the Louisiana Territory east of the Mississippi, and many Caribbean islands. The British colonists in North America were ecstatic, as the land to the west would soon be open for settlement and development. The land, however, was already occupied, namely by the many Iroquois and other native tribes who had fought alongside the British during the war. To avoid any incidents, King George III issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which forbade any settlement west of a line drawn along the Appalachian Mountains, known as the Proclamation Line. Effectively, the British had created an Indian reserve to the west of the Appalachians and east of the Mississippi. This did not sit well with American colonists, who felt that they had fought the French and Indian War to gain access to this land. Naturally, many ignored the proclamation and settled west, increasing tension between themselves and the natives, much to the dismay of British colonial authorities. Relations between the British government and the American colonists became increasingly strained through the 1760s, as Great Britain attempted to regain control of their economy. The 7 Years' War had grown from a territorial dispute into a full-fledged global conflict, with a cost to go with it. To pay off the war debt, the British Parliament levied a series of acts and taxes against the colonies in order to try and regain their lost financial footing. The colonists, who viewed themselves as loyal subjects to the British Crown, became increasingly agitated. It was not that the taxes were exorbitantly high. In fact, they were quite low, and often the measures taken by the British government were taken to lower the cost of British goods and raise the costs of those being sold by their French or Dutch competitors. For the colonists, the heart of the issue was not the cost, but rather the lack of consultation before levying the acts and taxes. As British subjects, the colonists believed they had all of the rights and liberties of any British citizen, which included representation. The British government argued that the colonists were represented virtually, and that the Parliament acted in their best interests. Many Americans did not agree, and resentment began to grow. The rallying cry became, "No taxation without representation," as more and more colonists began to view King George III as a tyrant and the British Parliament as an aggressor toward them. Great Britain had always regulated the economies of its respective colonies through acts and laws passed by Parliament. Through the last century, these laws had only been loosely enforced, as the economic gains of the American colonies also benefit Great Britain. As the 1760s began, however, Britain needed to regain control of the financial situation, sparking animosity from the colonists who had long appreciated their free economic relationship, and raising questions on the constitutional rights of the American colonists. In 1764, the Sugar Act was imposed to regulate the amount of French and Dutch sugar and molasses being imported to the colonies in favor of sugar and molasses being sold by the British East India Company. While it lowered the cost of sugar from the East India Company, colonists saw the act as a violation of their rights to trade and conduct business. Colonists protested the Sugar Act by boycotting British goods affected by the act. While this form of protest was not widely successful from an economic standpoint, the East India Company had one of its best years in 1774. The protest was noted by British Parliament, and many Whigs within the British government warned that relations could worsen if some sort of agreement could not be met. The following year, in 1765, the Parliament passed the Stamp Act. It was the first act of Parliament ever directed specifically at the colonies, as opposed to across the empire. The Stamp Act would require any form of official paper to need an official stamp. The act affected newspapers, almanacs, and official documents, such as licenses, deeds, and wills. It even meant that playing cards required the official stamp. Such a direct tax had never been levied against the colonists, and many saw it as an attack by the Parliament in response to the boycotts the year before. Secret organizations known as the Sons of Liberty began to appear throughout the colonies and threatened violence on anyone who sold the stamps. Indeed, violence began to break out across the region as the Sons of Liberty targeted British officials who enforced the act. In one such case, the home of Lieutenant Governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay and Chief Justice Thomas Hutchinson was ransacked by an angry mob led by the Sons of Liberty. While Hutchinson and his family escaped the violence, their home was destroyed. Some colonists, however, did not act out in violence, but relied instead on a united political action. 9 colonies sent representatives to the Stamp Act Congress in New York City and compiled a Declaration of Rights and Grievances for the British Parliament. The declaration stated the position of many of the American colonists, stating that the British taxes levied without representation violated their rights as not only British subjects, but as men. Again, the Americans engaged in protest by boycott, this time with significant results. The income from imports to the American colonies fell from £2,250,000 in 1764 to £1,944,000 in 1765. In England, American statesman Benjamin Franklin argued the case of the American colonies to Parliament and warned that continued abuse of the colonists could and would result in rebellion. Fortunately for the colonies, the Parliament experienced a shift in government which had sympathy for Whig politics, which resulted in the repeal of the Stamp Act. The Parliament passed the Declaratory Act in 1766, reversing the Stamp Act, but at the same time insisting that the Parliament as a legislative body had the right and power to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Both sides viewed the result as a political victory, believing that their interpretation of the rights of the colonists had been heard and secured. The Parliament believed it had exerted its will as the governing body of the colonies, and once and for all had established their right to levy laws on them. And the Americans believed that the British Parliament would not ever directly tax them again. Without some form of representation, a door had been left open, and if the British government was not careful, it might be able to close again. In 1767, things were still not going well economically for the British. The Rockingham government, which had helped repeal the Stamp Act, was suffering at the hands of their Tory opponents, who criticized them harshly and felt that they had been played by the American colonists. Charles Townshend, who served as the Chancellor of the Exchequer to the ministry of William Pitt the Elder, found himself in control of the administration when Pitt suddenly passed away in 1766. Townshend himself died a year later, but before he did, urged by the financial crisis and the insistence of the Tory factions within Parliament, passed a series of 5 acts which would collectively bear his name, the Townshend Acts. The first act, known as the Revenue Act, imposed direct taxation on lead, glass, paper, paint, and, notably, tea. The second created a new customs board for the North American colonies in Boston and allowed customs officials unprecedented control over vessels coming in and out of colonial ports. The third suspended the New York Assembly from conducting business until it had complied with the requirements of the Quartering Act, passed in 1765 alongside the Stamp Act. The fourth act, known as the Indemnity Act, colloquially known as the Tea Act, lowered the commercial duties on tea imported by the East India Company, hoping to combat the smuggling of Dutch East India tea into English ports. The final act, known as the Colonial Trade Act, passed after Townshend's death in 1767, also aimed to target smuggling and granted admiralty courts jurisdiction over all matters concerning customs violations, taking away the authority of local colonial courts. Before his death, Townshend feared that it would provoke a rebellious response from the American colonists. Townshend could not have been more correct. A flurry of activity gripped the American colonies. Pamphlets and letters flew from the pens of lawyers and farmers alike as they published their grievances in papers and broadsides across the colonies. Committees of correspondence were formed and shared ideas and debated the political and economic situation in the colonies. Once again, the Sons of Liberty were active, implementing the boycott of British goods and inciting riots where the opportunity was ripe. Particularly in Boston, unrest began to foment in such a way that the customs officials were obliged to leave town. This prompted British authorities to send for British troops to occupy Boston to quell the mob. On March 5, 1770, the consequences became quite clear when a young British sentry guarding the Boston Customs House was set upon by an angry mob of colonists. Accounts of the event state that the incident began as an argument between the private and a young wigmaker's apprentice, who upon insulting the private and his officer was warned away from the post. Refusing to go and further insulting the officer, he was struck in the head by the private's musket. A crowd began to gather as the altercation grew louder, and bells rang out indicating a fire, drawing yet more Bostonians toward the lone sentry. The sentry sent a runner to get help, as the crowd became more violent, throwing ice and oyster shells at the sentry and calling for him to fire his weapon. Captain Thomas Preston and a handful of men from the Grenadier Company of the 29th Regiment of Foot arrived at the scene and deployed around the sentry with bayonets fixed. The crowd, now grown to 300 or 400 by some estimates, pressed in around the British troops, still throwing objects and shouting for them to fire. Preston shouted for the crowd to disperse and ordered his men to load their muskets. As the crowd pressed in on Preston and his men, they shouted, "Fire, damn you, fire!" A young private was struck in the head by a flying object, causing him to drop his musket. He bent to retrieve it and stood up and unintentionally fired into the crowd without orders. In a panic, the rest of the soldiers fired into the crowd in a ragged volley. As the crowd broke in horror and the smoke cleared, it revealed 3 dead colonists: Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, and Crispus Attucks. A mixed-race former slave, Samuel Maverick and Patrick Carr, were wounded and would die shortly after. 5 colonists had been killed in what would be known as the Boston Massacre. The city was put on high alert, and British troops mustered in full force, preparing to defend against further riots. The trial which followed was a media circus, as the Sons of Liberty latched onto those who had died as patriots and martyrs. Attorney John Adams defended the British soldiers, despite his own personal feelings toward the British abuse of the American colonies, and his relationship to his cousin Samuel Adams, who was one of the founding members of the Sons of Liberty. Adams, whose devout loyalty to the law led him to believe that all men were entitled to a trial, no matter who they were or what they had done, successfully argued the men were not guilty of murder and had 6 of the soldiers acquitted and 2 others found guilty only of manslaughter. Adams' experience in the aftermath of the trial did little to move him closer to his cousin's patriot leanings, but did affirm his belief in the legitimacy of a government of laws. Tensions remained high in Boston, but gradually began to recede elsewhere. In 1773, amidst one of the worst banking crises of the 18th century, the British Parliament again made an attempt to ensure the survival of the British East India Company by undercutting the illegal importation of Dutch tea to the American colonies, while lowering the cost of EIC tea to the lowest possible amount. Known as the Tea Act of 1773, the act allowed the EIC to unload its cargo in the American colonies without paying any duties on it, while charging an exorbitant amount on Dutch tea. The act prompted the Sons of Liberty to organize a raid on 3 merchant ships docked in Boston Harbor, carrying loads of East India Company tea which had yet to be offloaded. Known as the Boston Tea Party, the Sons of Liberty boarded the ships and dumped 342 crates of tea into the harbor. The loss of tea amounted to approximately 9,659 pounds in 1773, the equivalent of $1.7 million today. Parliament was outraged and responded by passing a series of acts known as the Intolerable Acts in 1774. The first 3 acts, the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, and the Administration of Justice Act, all targeted Massachusetts alone, and punished the city of Boston and the Massachusetts Bay Colony for its role in the Tea Party. The Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston until the colonists paid for the destroyed tea. The act angered citizens in Boston who had not even participated in the Tea Party, and they felt they were being punished unjustly without being able to testify in their own defense. The Massachusetts Government Act revoked Massachusetts' charter and brought the colony under direct British control. Town meetings were limited, and all appointments had to be appointed by the royal governor. The Administration of Justice Act allowed the royal governor of Massachusetts to order the trial or retrial of any royal official to take place in Great Britain if the accused could not get a fair trial in Massachusetts. The final act, which affected all of the colonies, was the Quartering Act of 1774, which allowed royal governors to house soldiers in buildings if suitable quarters were not provided by the colonies. These acts were the last straw for many colonists. The perceived violation of what they viewed as their natural and constitutional rights as British subjects threatened to turn resentment of their British mother country to hatred and send the colonists into rebellion. Parliament hoped that the intolerable acts would isolate the problem, which seemed to be the strongest in Massachusetts. Meanwhile, the colonists began taking steps beyond simple committees of correspondence. The formation of the First Continental Congress in the fall of 1774 worked to redress the intolerable acts and petition the British government for a repeal, as they had in 1765 with the Stamp Act. The petition to the king never received a formal reply. With no reply from the British government, in May 1775, the colonies convened again. The Second Continental Congress found itself again attempting to organize a general boycott of British goods and achieve some kind of formal response from the Parliament when the tension which had gripped the American colonies since the end of the French and Indian War finally reached a breaking point in a small village outside of Boston on a mild mid-April morning in 1775. On the evening of April 18, 1775, with tensions running high between the people of Boston and the British troops garrisoned in and around the city, the Sons of Liberty discovered that General Thomas Gage planned to march British troops to a cache of weapons and powder hidden in Concord, just a few miles from Boston, and destroy the supply. Patriots Paul Revere and William Dawes rode through the Boston countryside and warned the population that the regulars are turning out, or as it's more popularly remembered, the British are coming. Colonial militiamen rose from their slumber, gathered their muskets, and rushed to stop the British troops from making it to Concord. On the morning of April 19, 1775, Massachusetts militiamen faced off against British regulars on the Lexington Town Green. When ordered to lay down their arms and return to their homes, the militia refused and stood their ground. Captain John Parker, commanding the group of 70 or so Massachusetts militia, ordered them not to fire unless fired upon first. British officers ordered their men to level their muskets, but cautioned them not to fire. Suddenly, a shot rang out. No one knows where the shot came from. Neither side laid claim, both blaming the other. With this moment, known as the shot heard around the world, the resentment and anger boiled over at last, and the war began. When the American Revolution began, it did not start as a revolution. While certainly the ideas it generated were revolutionary, the actions of the First Continental Congress were those of a legislative body, hoping to attain a form of reconciliation with the mother country. Better characterized as a rebellion, the earliest stages of the war were fought by the colonists to reclaim what they saw as their natural-born rights as British subjects and citizens. On the home front, early victories for the militias kept the spark of rebellion lit. However, it was not long before the British put a concerted effort into putting down the uprising. At the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775, British troops stormed earthworks held by the colonial militia near Boston in a costly victory. It was becoming clear to many that if the colonies did not unify, they would be crushed one by one. While some representatives in the Continental Congress, now in its second session, still erred on the side of caution, believing that a reconciliation could still be made, the Congress made the decision to form a single unified army to prevent their forces from being wiped out piecemeal. At the head of this new Continental Army would be a colonel from the colony of Virginia named George Washington. Washington, born from one of the most prominent families in colonial Virginia, had had aspirations to be a naval officer in the English Navy when he was a young man. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, was wary. She knew that a life at sea was a difficult one and could lead to an early death or maiming. She implored her son not to enlist in the Navy and to pursue a career in the Army instead. Washington obeyed and would spend much of his young adult life attempting to gain a commission in the British Army. He worked as a surveyor and endeared himself to the Royal Governor of Virginia, hoping to obtain that commission. It never came. Instead, Washington served as a colonel in the Virginia militia and implemented his own particular style of leadership, modeled after the British. Serving in this capacity, a young George Washington found himself at the center of some of the most important moments of the French and Indian War. At Fort Necessity and the Battle of Monongahela, Washington served alongside British soldiers as a colonial officer. And despite surviving numerous close calls with death and leading his troops valiantly, he was never made an official offer for a commission in the British Army. More than a decade after the end of the French and Indian War, Washington was serving as a representative of Virginia at the Second Continental Congress. When it came time for the Congress to decide who would lead this new united army, Washington was a natural choice. While his track record on the battlefield was less than stellar, his experience was unquestioned, and the fact that he was a Virginian pleased many of the Southern delegates of the Congress, as the war thus far had been fought by and almost entirely took place in the northern colonies. In June 1775, after receiving a unanimous vote of approval from the Congress, Washington rode north for Boston and began to construct the necessary administration for the new Continental Army. The Continental Army struggled with many issues. Supply was always a chief concern. Lack of food and a reliable supply chain meant that the army needed to constantly forage for sustenance. This meant a tense and sometimes violent relationship with the civilian populations near where the armies had camped. Command differences plagued the army as well. Beyond disgruntled and entitled officers, this army consisted of troops from nearly every once colony on the East Coast. These soldiers were as different from each other as if they had come from another country. In one early instance, General Washington literally had to pull soldiers off of each other during a snowball fight outside of Boston, which had turned into an outright brawl between soldiers from Massachusetts and Virginia. Uniting these men into a fighting force was a war unto itself. Through the winter of 1775 to 76, the Continental Army diverted its efforts in two directions. To the north, the Congress ordered an invasion of Quebec under the command of Generals Benedict Arnold and Richard Montgomery, hoping to rally the Canadians to form a 14th colony and rise against the British as well. It did not go as planned. And while successes were made in upstate New York, the invasion ultimately ended in a dismal failure. Montgomery was killed, and the majority of Continental force was either captured or succumbed to smallpox. Meanwhile, Washington stayed with the army around Boston and managed the siege. With 11,000 British troops trapped in the city, Washington hoped the winter would force them to surrender, but he lacked the artillery to mount a full-scale siege. He sent the young Colonel Henry Knox to acquire artillery from the recently captured Fort Ticonderoga, and in March 1776, Knox returned to Boston, having successfully gotten the guns over the Berkshire Mountains through the winter. With Knox's guns looking down from Dorchester Heights, the British decided to evacuate the city. On March 17, 1776, the Continental Army reoccupied Boston, much to the joy of the civilian population. In the spring of 1776, the war was beginning to spread to other parts of the 13 colonies. Fighting had broken out in the Carolinas, and a British siege of Charleston was thwarted by a daring defense of Sullivan's Island. In upstate New York, the survivors of the Canada expedition fought to hold on to the gains they had made at Fort Ticonderoga and other key locations on Lake Champlain. Washington's forces in Boston moved south to occupy New York City. The Continental Congress ordered Washington to defend the island city, despite the lack of a meaningful navy. Washington was uncertain his army, many of whom were untrained and undisciplined militia, was going to be capable of standing up to a British assault on the city. In Philadelphia, now the American capital, the Second Continental Congress had shifted from a government body imploring the British government for a redress of grievances to a government body responsible for the management